Chapter 7. The Technique of Spiritual Power. Our generation, expert in technological power, is strangely inexpert in spiritual power. The New Agers would differ about that claim. Adept in dealing with the natural sciences, we are, for the most part, novices in handling the important science of spiritual forces. There's been studies about people that think they have spiritual powers, and some of these studies have indicated that the psychic powers are less common with some of these people. We have learned to draw power out of the universe in 1,000 different ways. We drew power out for wireless and radio communication. We drew power out to operate our great turbines and machinery. Having tapped this power for use in so many practical ways, it should convince us that other and greater power lies waiting for our benefit. Accomplishments in the field of natural power, notable as they are, indubitably are but forerunners of greater achievements yet to be realized. An eminent scientist of the General Electric Company recently declared, each new item of our electrical past has opened still more fertile areas in the unknown. We can never reach a limit of discovery while we work. If it is true that further power lies waiting in the realm of electromagnetics, it throws into relief the possibility that there are other areas than mechanics where even greater power may lie. The story of mechanical and electrical invention is a bright, even amazing page in man's history. Those who pioneer in the discovery of spiritual power may ultimately, however, be marked as greater scientists and nobler benefactors than those who have operated in the field of materialistic science. No man can logically assume that the power utilized by the natural sciences is the only manifestation of power extant in the universe. The romance of exploring in the field of spiritual power holds the possibility of being one of the most alluring adventures of our age. Not long ago, I visited Greenfield Village, that fascinating display of early Americans, which was established by Mr. Henry Ford at Dearborn, Michigan. So many people are afraid of Dearborn, Michigan. Basically, they hate them for their freedom, or their want for more freedom, or that they would serve deity with that freedom. Among the interesting exhibits in the village is the original shop of Thomas A. Edison, in which the scientist worked at Menlo Park in his early career. Well, there's a Menlo Park, California, too, isn't there? It has been restored by Mr. Ford with complete fidelity to detail. Even to utilizing the original equipment, the shop is arranged as it appeared on the night Mr. Edison discovered the principle of the incandescent bulb some 40 years ago. So at the end of the 1800s, what year would that have been? Sitting there, I allowed my imagination free rein. I could see the great scientist back there, years ago, working in that shop, inwardly excited because he was on the track of a great idea and was thrilled by it. The universe was about to yield up one of its secrets, hidden jealously from the beginning of time. The scientific wizard ran his hands over the universe, feeling for something which he had not yet found, but instinctively knew was almost within his reach. Finally, his restless, searching hands stopped. He pressed, and light sprang out of darkness. The incandescent bulb was a fact. Night was turned into day. Candlelight and gaslight paled, and a new era was born. Now, I've been down streets that actually have gaslight. But it's mostly just for rich people to show off, right? As I lived, this opened my mind. I questioned if it is possible for a man to reach out into the universe and draw power and draw down power to light our cities and homes. Why can we not reach out into the same universe and draw out spiritual power to illuminate this world? Well, there's all that talk about drawing down the moon and all that stuff, right? To drive away the dark shadows of fear, prejudice, war, and economic troubles. Is there not resonant in the universe another light that will shine into the darkened corners of a man's mind and illuminate his soul? I cannot agree to the assumption that the Creator made a power to light up a room and failed to make a power to light up a man. To discover this kind of power demands no scientific genius like Edison, but simple, honorable, spiritually surrendered men willing to pay the cost. And that last bit is how you translate the term Muslim. And Muslima would be the female. But of course, the masculine would include the male, as usually. Because they say Muslimin, they don't need to say Muslimat. Our generation desperately needs this form of power. We have heretofore but a naive faith in sophisticated philosophies. Well, philosophy is not the same thing as quoting the philosophers, right? And bright machinery, but they have generally failed us. This broken, battered, and disillusioned world finds little strength or healing in ideas and points of view once so brightly, even jauntily cherished. Thoughtful men are realizing that we have lost contact with the genuine sources of power, and that a generation which felt itself to be and always adequate to its own needs is all but sterile in the face of overwhelming difficulties. We must once again tap that ancient and mystic power which in times past has saved men and nations. Our age must discover the impotency of many of its philosophies, complacent schemes, and machineries, and turn again to that deeper force we call the power of God. What society needs the individual man also requires. The problem of living with oneself is for most people the really difficult fact of life. Dwight L. Moody was once asked to name the man who had caused him more trouble than any other man he had ever met. Unhesitatingly and quickly he replied, "The man's name is Dwight L. Moody. I can say the same about Norman Vincent Peale," the author of the book. In fact, he gets on my nerves, for he is all too ready to do the things I do not want him to do, and he easily fails to do the things I do want him to do. Every honest man will make the same admission about himself. Well, it's important to focus on other than just the failures, but, working on them at the same time. A chief need of every individual is to find a power or force by which he can control himself and handle effectively the problems and burdens life lays upon him. To realize there is available for him a spiritual power which will carry his life forward in a manner as different as the motor car from the ox cart should awaken him to the point of seizing the romance of spiritual power. The problem for society and the individual is to learn how to secure and use this power. Here is where the church enters the picture. Well, there's a difference between ecclesia and church, right? Many people have a faulty conception of the church. They see it as a dull, often lifeless institution. Nowadays, one of the scams is that, if you're, it's lifeless because it's not led by a living leader. Well, some people say, the Pope or whatever, but you know what I mean? They say, well, Jesus isn't here on earth. So it's like, well, if the teachings work, or or some other prophet or whatever, but that's not what they mean. Some time ago, I went through Schenectady, New York, and my train passed the General Electric plant where they generate and deal in power. I chanced to see, not far away, an old church which had apparently fallen into some disuse. It had a look of resigned hopelessness and defeatism about it. It occurred to me that essentially the function of the church is that of the General Electric Company, to release power. But the former was content, it seemed, to mumble prayers and recite creeds. So you don't mumble the prayers, you thoughtfully go through them, and then that dum-dum goes away. It had forgotten its purpose, which is to release for the individual and society the spiritual power inherent in the world and freely offered to those who want it and will take it. It did that in its early days. Christianity then obviously possessed power. It was an overwhelming sensation in every community into which it came. In tragically few places, it is a sensation today. Too often it seems to be old, dead stuff which makes little or no impression on the community life. The power within Christianity, however, is not dead. It is merely impeded in its flow by hollow forms and as empty formalists, but, like rivers, when the spring freshets come again and again in human history, it has broken its dams and overflowed with refreshing vitality into the life of the world. That flood, I believe, is again on the way. Religious leaders are learning that as the church recognizes its function to be the teaching of the simple and practical technique of spiritual power to day-by-day men and women, it is opening the way for a new chapter in the romance of the Spirit. The church has been stung by the fact pointed out by such men as Dr. C.G. Jung, the noted psychologist, that today, in ever-increasing numbers, harassed men turn to the physician rather than to the minister for mental and spiritual relief, in the wholly worthwhile attempt to create a new social order. The church has neglected with tragic frequency the human beings who make up that same social order and who have been hard put to it to get a handout of spiritual bread by which to live with some degree of strength and courage in the social order that is. Well, if they read things and thought about them themselves, like Protestantism was supposed to do, is to get people more in touch with the sources rather than the authority. Real Christianity is that to which baffled, frustrated people should be able to turn as thirsty men to a deep, cool spring where invigorating waters flow. Our fathers knew the art of spiritual power. They harnessed it to their lives and their society. One of the supreme needs of this generation is a concrete, simple, workable technique of the spiritual life. People must not only be told they should pray, but also be taught how to pray. If they are told that God will help them, they must also know, in a practical sense, just how to receive that aid. In a word, we need to relearn the definite procedure for releasing spiritual vitality in the individual and in society. How is it to be done? Let us say, first of all, that the former belief in religion, or mere observance of its forms, yields little practical aid, but that personal surrender taps overflowing reservoirs of spiritual power. A glance at the history of religion and its effect on men illustrates what I have in mind. Christ, as he neared the end of his career on earth, was on a hilltop with his disciples. In his years of association, he had become well acquainted with these men, realizing their weakness and knowing their strength. They were simple Galilean peasants, Ordinary, run-of-the-mill fellows. Some were fishermen, one was a tax gatherer, and none of them had any particular claim to distinction. Looking at them, the master said, an apparently impossible thing, "Ye shall receive power after the Holy Spirit has come upon you." In current speech, that was to say, you men are to be endowed with amazing power, the like of which you never dreamed, when God's abiding Spirit is received into your hearts. They were simple enough to believe that he knew whereof he spoke. They were naive enough to take him at his word, and with what a result the Bible, with simple eloquence, tells us that they went out and turned the world upside down, and so they did. They changed the stream of history, they inspired the rewriting of the philosophies of the world, they upset the political map for generations yet to be, they toppled autocrats off the thrones of great empires, they destroyed those empires, they established democracy, well, usually not democracy, usually republics or something else, right? They have kept the world in ferment until now, and will continue to do so until the kingdom comes. They moved forward with a power that was irresistible. These simple men, read the story of their conquest of Athens, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. These men had no learning, but they moved up against Athens, where they found the great towering intellects and a cultural life imperious and haughty. These thinkers of Athens examined with speculative curiosity and intellectual dilettantism every new idea, but nothing had ever laid hold of their wills or changed their lives until these men came with an intellectual and spiritual force that cut through to the very heart of their idle skepticism. And perhaps we can say further that if a person gets in such a mode and that becomes automatic, it takes it to a further step. But if you're automatic and meaningless, purposeless, whatever, it can lack, it can lack ability, and you may not even notice. Why do you think we drink so much coffee and stuff like? Well, I mean, I don't, but you know what I mean. These plain peasants march up to the Acropolis, and in one of the most amazing romances of history, captured in the name of Christ, the intellectual citadel of their age. How is it to be explained? On one basis only. They had tapped the secret of a power that nothing could stop. They were never more than a small fraction of the great population of the East. They were people from the lower stratum of society. They had no money, no education, no social standing, no prestige, in short, no reason at all for their amazing accomplishment, except the supreme one that they had discovered the technique of an all-conquering power. So it has been throughout all history, when the moral and spiritual life of the world had fallen to a low ebb, when society had become corrupt and the church was innocuous, there lived in the beautiful city of Assisi, down among the Umbrian hills, a joyous youth by the name of Francis. He lived for pleasure and was crowned by his companions king of the revels. Okay, maybe he was gay. Because the Greco-Roman culture referred to a homosexual as a pleasure seeker. Everybody seeks pleasure, but that was the phrase. But he was not satisfied with his life. And one day in a wayside shrine, he stopped for rest, little realizing the wonder about to take place. He came as most people come to a church, not expecting anything to happen. The priest was idly and indifferently reading over the words of the scriptures when the miracle happened. Or was it a miracle? The cold print, often thought to be lifeless, began to glow. All that talk about the living word, it's not just Jesus, it's, something that we can do with the prosaic word. It became incandescent, and fire leaped from it into the heart of Francis, and he was transformed. I don't know if this is metaphorical interpretation or is this experience that he said. He moved out into the roadways of Italy, into the streets of crowded cities, preaching with such winsome beauty and such effectiveness that he transformed his age, and the fragrance of his life lingers to this very day. What had happened? He too had discovered the secret found by the disciples 12 centuries before, and had become the awestruck possessor of mighty spiritual power. Again, in the 18th century, the saddest days in her history had fallen upon England. It was the period of Walpole, in which English morals and religion were all but prostrate. Multitudes were living in degradation. Society, for the most part, was licentious and impure. Politics was corrupt. Even the clergy were, many of them, men of unworthy life, and the churches, half-heartedly supported, were shorn of spiritual influence. Into this situation, like a current of fresh air from sunlit mountain peaks, appeared one, John Wesley, and it came about in this way. One night, this young preacher, who possessed a cold ethical philosophy, but no power other than that bequeathed by a brilliant intellect and noble heritage, went into a meeting in Aldersgate Street. Here, as in the case of Francis, a man was reading the scriptures. Again, the cold print grew warm. It began to glow until it became incandescent. With a white heat and power leaped from the book into the heart of Wesley, who went out and preached with such eloquence and persuasion that multitudes were changed. When the story of his era was written, Green, the historian of the British people, declared that more was accomplished for England under the preaching of the Wesleys than all the victories won on land or sea by the elder Pitt. What had happened? Wesley, like Francis and the disciples, had discovered in the 18th century the technique of spiritual power. Well, maybe more of a cultural influence had occurred, but nowadays, what, African Europeans are the ones that go to church in England, and they're the minority. They're the majority churchgoers, but they're the minority. Christianity may often be likened to a subterranean river, which for long periods is out of sight and at low ebb, during which the ground becomes parched and vegetation withers and dies. But just when it seems as if a spiritual drought is destroying the finest flowers of civilization, lo, the river bursts forth as a sparkling fountain and falls in life-giving freshness upon a parched and weary land. Fertility is restored, the arts and sciences flourish, learning becomes rich and good works are prolific. Civilization again becomes green and culture thrives. Humanity steps up into new realms of happiness and well-being. Too long now have we been in a dry and weary wilderness. We have no power within ourselves to restore new life to humanity. Only the fountain breaking through as in former times can save us. As the farmer in the dust bowl gazes at the sky, longing for rain, so does our generation seek for that rainfall of the Spirit, which will bring the greenness of new life to a burned-out world. When men are willing to accept the power proffered by God, they can have it. There was sufficient reason why Jesus urged men to become as little children. Only in that way could they be naive enough to take what was offered them, a simple turning of men to God with an honest sense of need and a willingness to be guided by Him, would now, as at any other time in the world's history, release this power, for it is not dead. It is only quiescent. How can the individual secure the spiritual power? In the releasing of spiritual power, the removal of a subtle blockade to a free flow of that power is important. This has to do with the matter of ethical and moral obstructions. It is at this point that thoughtful men are realizing that the trouble with our age may not be a lack of intellectual brilliance, but rather moral deficiency. Dr. Alex Carrel in Man, the Unknown has an unforgettable passage. Despite the immense hopes which humanity has placed in modern civilization, such a civilization has failed in developing men of sufficient intelligence and audacity to guide it along the dangerous road on which it is stumbling. Human beings have not grown so rapidly as the institutions sprung from the brains. It is chiefly the intellectual and moral deficiencies of the political leaders and their ignorance which endanger modern nations. For some strange reason, written into the Constitution of the universe, the power of God in spiritual form cannot in any abundance flow past the evil in men's lives. To the degree to which men generally seek and receive forgiveness and live a cleansed moral life, does spiritual power operate in their affairs. When men are crooked, their affairs will be crooked, for obviously they cannot see straight. As a man thinketh in his heart, so he is a truism for society as well as for the individual. Some time ago in New York City, all lights north of 59th Street suddenly flickered out. Elevators stopped running, machines ceased to move, movie houses became dark, electric power was flowing all about the city, ready to be used. In fact, had been freely used, but now it was dark. Investigation revealed that in an important power station, which served all of that section of the metropolis, a very small foreign object had lodged at a vital contact point and had effectively shut off the electrical power of the entire universe from a section of the greatest city in the world. Dirt has gotten in, it seems, at the contact point between human society and the power of the external. Well, perhaps it's, the dirt was there all along, but, it's the de-spiritualization of matter. Well, I mean, matter is matter, but you know what I mean, the not putting it in that context. Dirt in men's minds has cut off that benign influence that could do away with wars, create an improved economic order, and bestow happiness and peace upon people everywhere. As I said to the FBI agents that stopped by on September 26th, 2023, that, I virtually condemned all wars based on the principles that I've brought forth, This dirt must be removed, and it cannot be eliminated by any political party or world conference, however lofty its idealism, but only by the inflowing of fresh, cleansing tides from the clean places of the Spirit of God. Within man's inner life lies the secret of his outer well-being. It is this fact which makes a reinvigorated Christianity of such urgent importance to our time. Those who regard religion as formality in worship or pious theory have assigned to it a place far too small, for it has become in reality the cohesive and curative force in life, and is as vital to man's corporate and personal health as the violet rays of the sun falling upon the earth. A few years ago, I crossed the ocean on the westward voyage on the linear Aquitania. With me was a friend who discovered that the ship carried a ship-to-shore telephone. It was late at night when we entered the little telephone office, and my friend inquired if he could talk with a friend in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Informed that he could do so, he gave the number and placed the call. We were then 1,000 miles at sea, and I knew that Newcastle lay 500 miles inland. In a moment, however, the operator told us to go into booth number 1, where my friend lifted the receiver of an ordinary telephone, and we conversed with utmost clarity over 1,500 miles of water and mountains. It so happened that at that very moment my mother was on a ship in the Pacific Ocean off Yokohama. On the other side of the world, it occurred to me that it would be a wonderful thrill for my mother and me if I were to telephone her from my ship in the Atlantic Ocean to hers in the Pacific. Accordingly, I inquired of the operator if I could make the call. He said that it could be done, but that the call was, of course, dependent upon my mother's ship having a telephone. I told him that it was the President Coolidge. He looked up in a telephone directory and informed me that the President Coolidge had no telephone. What, I said, is it possible that any well-regulated ship in this enlightened age should not have a telephone? But upon second thought, as I considered that the name of the ship was the President Coolidge, and he being famed for silence, I could understand. Sensing my disappointment, the operator said that even though the President Coolidge had a telephone, it would be very difficult to establish clear communication with my mother for the reason that, whereas we were in nighttime, she was in daylight. He said it was possible to speak with comparative ease from light to light or from dark to dark or within the same medium, but that when an attempt was made to telephone from either dark to light or from light to dark, the results were seldom satisfactory. Well, the distance, it wasn't, because daylight one place. Thus it appeared that if I wished to establish a clear communication with my mother, it would be necessary for me to go from out the dark and into the light. So, in this world of storm and struggle, sensing as I do my personal need of power and the desperate need of my fellow men everywhere, we reach out into the universe for help from one who alone can save us, but we cannot hear, nor do we receive strength we need. Now, the Luciferian principle, lux et nox, nox et lux, is, really more what's being represented over there, right? Nor do we receive the strength we need. The fault is not with God, but with ourselves. The trouble is that we are in the dark, and our world is dark, and our hearts are dark. When we leave that darkness, however, and move forward into the light, radiant energy comes upon us, and we are endowed with power and to spare, which will easily satisfy our personal needs and those of society at large. Spiritual power is realized also by faith in and surrender to God. These two terms are closely related because they are old religious terms and therefore perhaps not clear to the average man. They need interpretation. By faith, we do not mean intellectual assent to a prescribed doctrine or creed. Rather do we refer to childlike trust in and dependence upon God in a manner similar to the attitude a child would have toward a loving father. Surrender is predicated on faith, but perhaps goes a step further. It has a double meaning. First, to surrender is to take something out of your life, to give it up, to part with it, or perhaps just to turn it over with intentions and principles, right? Obviously, it means to give up sin of any kind or degree, gross sins of the flesh manifestly, but also the more subtle sins of the disposition. Many so-called Christians might not inappropriately be termed segment Christians, which is to say that they have been changed or converted only in certain segments of their nature. Well, there's been change in some segments, right? But a lot of what people have is, as they say, the liberal. The liberal has the value. I don't mean some political side or whatever. They only have the values that they consider to be necessary for popular things or what they feel like. Any other religious or family values, who knows what they're going to have, or they may give it up or something. Why do you think there's so many divorces and stuff? Oh, they don't feel like treating their spouse right. Then it's over, right? They may have given 9/10 of their lives to God's direction, but 1/10 may still belong to a lower order. Perhaps a certain clergyman may fall under this classification. When asked how his church was doing, he glumly replied, "Not so well," and then hastened to add, "But the Baptists aren't doing any better." Which, shouldn't matter. The fact that he said it at all, to say nothing of the satisfaction implied, would indicate that at least a segment of his life needed to be surrendered or have something more taken out of it. Secondly, surrender means to put something into your life, and the thing to put in is faith, the kind of faith by which one can truly rest on God. Great power is available to the person who learns to trust God completely, that is, to utterly rest his life with all of its problems and burdens on God. Alas, most of us do not have faith of this variety. We mumble a few creeds, live more or less respectable lives, and think we are people of faith, which we are not. Real faith is inevitably associated with lives of power and effectiveness. I spent my summers on Long Island, on the shores of Peconic Bay. There I enjoyed swimming, going in frequently, twice a day. No one will ever read about my swimming in the sport pages of the daily paper, nor will I ever win any medals as a swimmer, but I am the best floater on Long Island. A lot of people, I saw somebody had to make excuses. Oh, my song. It's like, yeah, I'm, it's not the best of songs. I'm just having fun parroting things, right? That's the thing. If you're conveying your meaning, if you're having your experience, if you're doing it for yourself, How did I learn to float? I saw people floating, and it looked a bit easier than swimming. At any rate, I felt a swimmer should know how to float. I inquired of a good floater as to how it was done. His advice was good and was to the effect that one must allow the water to hold him up. In other words, one must believe in the water. Accordingly, I waded in, all the time repeating my creed to the water. I believe in thee, O water. I believe thou wilt hold me up. Yeah, people actually do stuff like that. Like people literally think the tarot cards are going to answer them. But I did not mean it in my heart any more than many church attendants mean the creeds they recite on Sunday. So it's a phrase, but it's like he knew the water was going to answer him. It's just, he's putting that idea of water into his mind. But see, that would go further than a lot of people do. Nor did my creed to the water give me any better results, for I lay back on the water, holding myself stiff and unrelaxed in a tense and fearful attitude. Looking up, I saw the blue sky, but only for a moment, for quickly it turned to green, and I swallowed a liberal portion of the Peconic Bay. Clearly something was wrong with my technique of floating. I persevered, however, and one day I lay back upon the water, completely relaxed, giving myself to the water without stress or tension, and wholly unreserved. To my amazement and great satisfaction, I discovered I was floating. Under me was a mighty bosom of water. Holding me up and sustaining me with ease, I became conscious of a power under me that was vast and illimitable. Such, in essence, is the experience of people have who learn to trust God, who surrender their lives into His keeping. You hear them with happy voices saying, underneath are the everlasting arms, and again, I can do all things through Christ. Of course they can, with power like that. And still getting rumbly the tumbly. I'm not sure if you heard,